Nearly 2,000 years ago, an obscure man emerged out of Galilee. And despite not coming from a particularly impressive background, he was so inspiring. His words seemed so authoritative that people began speculating that maybe he was the long-awaited Messiah. And there was good reason to think this. He certainly seemed to have a way with people. When he spoke, hundreds, maybe thousands of people gathered to listen. He was able to convince, especially his followers, to put their faith in him so deeply that they could take radical action in support of his cause. So finally, the moment of action came, and this individual led his followers into a violent attack against the Roman army itself, which unfortunately failed. Oh, I'm sorry. You didn't think I was talking about Jesus of Nazareth, did you? I can see how that would be confusing. No, I was not talking about Jesus. Actually, I was talking about a figure who came about 30 years before Jesus, named Judas the Galilean. He was one of many, actually, would-be messiahs in Israel's history. Individuals who felt that God was calling them to take some bold stance against their overlords, whether it was the Romans or the Greeks or the Babylonians, which unfortunately led to failure. And in this particular individual's case, he's worth naming because he would have still been fresh in the memories of Jesus's contemporaries. He was influential in getting a zealot movement picked up, one that seemed to have an effect on several of Jesus's followers. And in fact, there's some speculation that Judas Iscariot gets his name in part from Judas the Galilean, either directly or indirectly from the Sicarii branch of zealots that this individual started. But there was another reason that he would have been remembered by Jesus's time as well. And that was because of his defeat and execution. Now, unfortunately, the sources aren't very detailed. We don't know exactly what it was that happened to Judas himself, but we have a little bit more information about two of his sons, whom the Romans killed through the worst form of execution they had available: crucifixion. This was a tool that they did not use all the time. It was actually against their law to use it on Roman citizens. It was only reserved for the most extreme of situations, for sedition, for people who put themselves up against the Roman Empire itself. But anybody who claimed to be the Messiah had to face this possibility. They had to reckon with the Roman cross. Now, I think it's helpful to keep this in mind when we're reflecting on this story that Angie just read for us about this conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. This is a critical conversation. It's really the turning point in the gospel, because after this conversation, Jesus begins heading for the final time to Jerusalem, where he will be arrested, crucified, and ultimately raised from the dead. It's this journey that we celebrate during the season of Lent, the new Christian season that we have just entered into this week. And I think it's helpful to keep this background in mind when we realize that this was a conversation that was being held in hushed tones. That the disciples had it with Jesus when they were in kind of an obscure area in the region of Caesarea Philippi. So probably on a road that wasn't even anywhere near a major city or town. And why did they have this conversation there? Well, in part, because it was dangerous. It was a risky thing to say that someone was the Messiah. Now, I don't think that the disciples were entirely surprised by this. Although Peter is the only one who articulates it, we have reason to believe that several of the disciples were thinking or hoping that maybe Jesus was this Jewish Messiah. They were ready to follow him into a battle against any form of evil or oppression that was out there. But even so, even for those with the deepest faith, it must have been a moment of gravitas. It was a serious moment when you heard your leader say something that could lead you to a terrible death if he turned out to be a false Messiah. That concept of a false Messiah, that risk that we could be getting it wrong, is an idea that is so significant that it has carried on, in fact, long after the Jewish regions of Galilee and Judea ceased to exist. Of course, it translates into the Christian tradition through the concept of the Antichrist, an idea that has had quite a big impact on Christian history. But even outside of religious contexts, in the secular world, this concept of a false Messiah has a big impact. For example, on psychology. Although we don't use the language now quite as much as we used to, it's not uncommon to talk about messianic complexes or messianic thinking, or even false messiahs in a psychological sense. This language refers to a delusional belief, either that you as an individual are God, or on a smaller scale, that some outside force will rescue you and resolve you from all of your worries and problems. So, for example, if you're convinced that you just have to keep buying those lottery tickets until the one comes around that's going to make you a millionaire, that's messianic thinking. Or if a person who has been in a number of troubled relationships, upon meeting a new love interest, immediately thinks, finally, this is the one who's going to make everything right. It's messianic thinking. And we've even seen it in a bigger scale in our society recently with conspiracy theories, such as the QAnon theory, that hopes that some major political figure will come in and change things and save the day. It's messianic thinking in a bad way, putting our hopes in a false Messiah. And here we have to acknowledge something that's a little bit uncomfortable, and that is that people of faith tend to be a little more susceptible to this kind of unhealthy messianic thinking than non-religious folks. These kinds of hopes that aren't healthy and religious ideas can easily get mixed together. Perhaps a person is convinced that God is the one who will give them the winning lottery ticket, or that they've been set on a divine path to meet this love interest who may or may not be good for them. And there's even evidence that this most recent QAnon conspiracy that I was mentioning earlier draws in particular people of a Christian bent or persuasion. It kind of makes sense when you think about it. I mean, if you are inclined to believe that there are these evil powers and principalities in the world around us that we can't see, is it that much more to believe that there's a evil conspiracy amongst government leaders going on behind the scenes? Or if you think that a leader who has been missing for 2,000 years is going to ultimately come back and save the day, Is it that unbelievable to suggest that somebody who has recently been in power will, contrary to all evidence, come back? It raises some difficult questions for us about what is healthy, God-inspired faith, a faith that sometimes calls us to believe what's not immediately in front of us, believe beyond what evidence suggests, and what is just unhealthy, delusional thinking. And you might be inclined to say, well, it's actually not that complicated. It's simple. It's a matter of who or what you're putting your faith in, right? If you're listening to radio shows and conspiracy theories that say bizarre things, don't trust that. But if it comes from the Bible, believe it. If someone is telling you to put your faith in some current human being, then that's a problem. But if they tell you to put your faith in Jesus, then you know that you'll be okay. And I appreciate that at some level, but I'm not convinced that even that completely resolves it. In fact, in our passage today, Peter gets it right. And yet he still has a problem with delusion. Now remember, at the beginning of this passage that we read, Peter correctly identifies Jesus as the Messiah, saying, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." This was a big claim. This was one of the highlights of Peter's career, as being the one to name this truth. And Jesus confirms that he was right, that he was not delusional, that this insight had come from God when he says immediately afterwards, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." So this was coming directly from God. It was divine inspiration. It was a healthy, appropriate faith. Nevertheless, Peter still got it wrong. Just a few verses later, Peter begins expanding on or pushing his own idea of what being the Messiah meant. And Jesus offers a very strong rebuke. The text says, "He turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me.'" Now that is a sharp turn. He says that this has been revealed by my Father in heaven, and blessed are you in one verse, and then just a few verses later, he's saying that Peter is being deluded directly by Satan himself. He's functioning as Satan's mouthpiece. How could he have been that wrong when he had gotten it so right, when the revelation came from God? Well, Jesus explains it in one line later, a line that's always jumped out to me, where he says, "For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Or I have to admit, I actually prefer the NIV version of this verse, which says it like this: "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." See, what Peter was doing is that he was taking his hopes, his desires for salvation, his idea of what it ought to look like, and projecting it on to Jesus. And therefore, even though he got it right, even though Jesus was the Messiah and he was right about that, and God had led him to that conclusion, he was making a grave mistake. His faith was off because he was not listening to divine concerns, to what it was that God had in mind when speaking about the Messiah. And this, I think, is a warning for all of us. I think we all have a tendency to project our own sense of salvation, our own desires, our own sense of what it is God is doing in our lives onto God, especially when it relates to suffering. When you think about it, what it was that led Peter to make this false proclamation in the passage was something Jesus had just said. You see, Jesus had just been explaining earlier that he was going to have to suffer, which meant that the disciples would suffer with him. The text says, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering. The hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. That didn't make sense to Peter. It doesn't make sense. You're trying to save us from suffering, not into it. And so he can't help it. He challenges Jesus on this, but instead of Jesus clarifying or accepting it, Jesus doubles down. In fact, he goes and finds a larger crowd of people besides just his private group of disciples, and he makes this extraordinarily provocative statement that if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Take up their cross. Remember, this was the ultimate symbol in Roman society of failure. When the Romans had a Messiah on the cross, it meant that they had failed. They were not the Messiah. They wanted to make a show of it, that they had been defeated and killed, and that anybody who followed them would fall into the same fate. That was exactly what Jesus and his followers were trying to avoid, or what every messianic would-be hero was trying to avoid. And yet Jesus leads us right in that direction. Not, I think, because he wants us to suffer, not because suffering is intrinsically good, but because the road to salvation often goes right through suffering. See, God can see things that we can't see. Our beliefs, our reactions are often informed by just this instinctual rejection of pain, this instinctive fear. Something is bad and we want to get out of it. And if we believe in God, then we believe that God won't make us deal with it. But that's not always how it works. More often than not, when God is saving us, it involves taking up that very pain and suffering ourselves and walking right through it. So I know there are a lot of things that are happening in the world right now that we would like to fix. There are a lot of situations that many of us just want to be out of. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think that God is wanting us to suffer any longer than we have to. But when we're considering how we respond to it, we have to ask whether we have in mind the concerns of God, or we're simply giving in to our human concerns. Perhaps for those of us who are dealing with depression, who are so eager to just shake off the negative feelings, understandably so, perhaps the depression has something it's trying to teach us. Perhaps there's a lesson in the negative feelings that we're experiencing. Those of us who are going through failures where things aren't working out like we thought they would work out, maybe it's not just a matter of give it time and the right thing will come. Perhaps the failures themselves are meant to teach us humility, or are challenging us to calculate our understanding of what success is or what it is that God really wants from our lives. Perhaps those of us who find ourselves mired in a struggle, who are just wishing that it could be over, might hear from God that this is an opportunity to grow in depth and character, not just to get through it, but to be changed by it into an even more faithful follower of Jesus. Although the four gospel writers have some different ideas about what exactly it meant and what it entailed to be the Messiah, they all agreed on this: that Jesus's unique claim to being the Messiah was one that calls us to follow him through suffering. Not because it's good, not because God wants us to suffer, but because oftentimes it is only in taking this tough path to Jerusalem that we will ever get out of the suffering and find our way to salvation.